Have you ever looked up at the night sky and felt a pull towards that one quiet, reddish star? It isn't the brightest nor the closest of our celestial neighbors, but it holds a unique place in our imagination. A place of beginnings, of what-ifs. A mirror to our own world, yet utterly alien. For generations we've looked at it and dreamt of a future written in footsteps on crimson dust. But what if that future isn't in some distant, unknowable century? What if the pull became a journey and that star a home, not for our great-grandchildren, but for us? My name is Alex, and welcome to Divergence Point. Together we explore the futures that might have been, and the ones that are unfolding right now, just beyond our sight. Today I want to invite you to consider a new map of human ambition, a map that, for all of history, has had only one center of gravity, one world. We are going to explore the consequences of a simple but profound divergence. What if the first self-sustaining city on Mars is not only established, but becomes a global power all within the next 10 years? A city not just of survival, but of influence. A city named Meridian, whose soaring glass domes and subterranean avenues begin to pull the world's center of gravity away from London, from New York, from Dubai, and towards the silence of the red planet. This isn't a fantasy of a distant tomorrow. The seeds of this future are already being sown in the coastal winds of Texas, in the clean rooms of California, and in the fiery ascent of rockets that are, right now, redefining what is possible. SpaceX's Starship, the largest and most powerful launch vehicle ever conceived, is not just a machine of metal and fire. It's a statement of intent. Each successful test flight, each controlled landing, is another sentence in a story that ends with humanity becoming a multi-planetary species. The official timelines are cautious, as they should be. They speak of the late 2030s, perhaps the 2040s, a gradual, methodical push into the cosmos, fraught with the immense challenges of radiation, life support, and the sheer, unforgiving distance. But progress is not always linear. Sometimes it's a cascade, a convergence. This is our point of divergence, a moment where the methodical timeline is shattered by an unprecedented acceleration. It's a future where the final, critical hurdles, the complex dance of orbital refueling, the perfection of closed-loop life support, the AI-driven precision of landing a skyscraper on a world millions of miles away, are not solved in sequence over decades, but in parallel over a handful of years. A sudden, explosive blossoming of capability, funded not just by a single visionary, but by a consortium of sovereign wealth funds and private investors who see what is coming, the opening of a new frontier, not just for science, but for civilization and for commerce, is a profound and perhaps unsettling thought. But before we journey there, I would ask you to pause for a moment, to feel this space we share right now. Where in the world are you watching this? What time is it for you? Are you in the deep of night or the warmth of the afternoon sun? The light from our world takes between 4 and 24 minutes to reach Mars. The thoughts we are sharing now could already be on their way. If you feel a connection to this shared curiosity, perhaps you'll consider subscribing and joining our quiet explorations. We would be grateful to have you here. So, the decision is made. The first mission, originally planned as a tentative scouting party of a dozen pioneers, is reframed. The scale of the ambition shifts from planting a flag to laying a foundation. This will not be an outpost, this will be a city. The ships that leave will not be explorers' vessels, but the modern equivalent of the Mayflower, carrying the architects, engineers, and geneticists, the digital and biological seeds of a new world. They are not going to visit Mars, they are going home, and they will call it Meridian. But a dream, when it collides with reality, makes a sound. It is not always a sound of celebration. Sometimes it is the sharp, grating noise of friction, of an old world order refusing to yield. The speed with which Meridian rose from a blueprint to a reality, a gleaming scar on the face of the Ares Vallis, was not seen as a miracle by everyone. For the established centers of power on Earth, it was an unnerving spectacle, an affront. It was the audacity of a future arriving uninvited and decades ahead of schedule. The story we tell ourselves about the Great Migration is one of heroic unity, of humanity striding forth together. The truth, as always, is a more complicated, more shadowed thing. That first decade was not a shared project. It was a silent, desperate race. The acceleration that made Meridian possible was not just technological, it was geopolitical. It required a severing, a deliberate, calculated uncoupling from the bureaucracies and committees of Earth. The consortium that funded the city's genesis did so by bypassing international treaties, by creating their own legal frameworks in the vacuum of space, by moving faster than any terrestrial government could legislate. They did not ask for permission. They broadcasted their progress reports as statements of fact. New York, London, Beijing. They awoke one morning to find that the most valuable real estate in the solar system was not in Manhattan or the city, but under a radiation-shielded dome 40 million miles away. And it was owned by no nation they recognized. A ghost had entered the world's political machine. The reaction was predictable. It was quiet at first, a tightening of regulations on orbital launches from Earth, a sudden, inexplicable series of technical glitches that delayed supply ships, a flood of UN resolutions condemning the extra-national sovereignty of the Martian settlement. But these were the moves of a fading monarch, the flow of capital, of talent, of pure, unfiltered ambition had already begun its inexorable shift outward. The brightest minds from Caltech and Cambridge, the most ruthless traders from Wall Street and Hong Kong, the most visionary artists from Paris and Sao Paulo, they didn't see borders, they saw a new canvas, and they began to disappear from Earth, their digital and physical lives rematerializing in the thin, manufactured air of Meridian. This is where the intensity begins. Not with an explosion, but with a whisper, a realization. On Earth, it was the chilling understanding that they were losing control of the human story. The levers of power they had held for millennia, geography, military, economy, were becoming strangely ineffective. How do you sanction a city that grows its own food, recycles its own water, and prints its own tools from native Martian regolith? How do you project power against a population whose greatest asset is the very distance that separates you from them? But on Mars, a different kind of intensity was taking root. It was the weight of perfection, the psychological burden of living in a masterpiece of engineering that had absolutely no tolerance for error. Every single citizen of Meridian was, by necessity, an integral part of a vast, delicate life support machine. A single cracked seal, a single corrupted line of code in the atmospheric processes, a single miscalculation in the recycling of organic waste, any of these could mean a cascade failure, extinction. They lived with the hum of borrowed time in their ears, a constant reminder of the three things that separated their vibrant city from a silent tomb: energy, pressure, and the unforgiving mathematics of survival. They were not Earthlings anymore. A new consciousness was being forged in the Red Desert, one that saw the home world not with nostalgia, but with a kind of detached pity. They saw a planet mired in its own history, its endless conflicts, its wasteful abundance. They watched Earth's news feeds, the wars, the politics, the storms, and it felt like transmissions from a distant, chaotic past. Their umbilical cord of radio waves became a one-way mirror. Earth was the grand, beautiful, and deeply flawed experiment they had left behind. They were the control group. And then came the flare, not a small one, a coronal mass ejection of a magnitude seen only once a century, and it was aimed directly at them. Earth got the warning first, and the planet's magnetic field would absorb the blow, creating beautiful, harmless auroras. Meridian had only its technology, its network of subterranean shelters, and the 12 minutes of light speed delay for the warning to even reach them. For 3 days, as a wave of stellar fire washed over the planet, all communication ceased. 3 days, the city of Meridian was utterly alone. 3 days, Earth held its breath, wondering if its audacious child had finally been silenced. And in those 3 days of profound, terrifying isolation, surrounded by the static of a raging star, the citizens of Meridian truly understood what they had become. The first generation of a new and terribly fragile humanity. They were no longer a colony. They were a world of their own. And they had just survived their own apocalypse. When the static finally cleared, the first message from Meridian was not one of relief, nor was it a request for aid. It was 5 words, broadcast across all public channels, a simple, declarative statement to the silent, waiting world. We are still here. And in the profound quiet that followed those words, everyone on Earth understood that the transmission was not an answer, but an announcement. The umbilical cord had not just been tested, it had been burned away by the fire of a star. Humanity now spoke with 2 distinct voices, and one of them had learned to sing in a vacuum. The intensity of what came next was not measured in megatons or market points, but in the slow, creeping sense of cultural and intellectual vertigo that began to ripple through the institutions of Earth. The competition was never going to be about skyscrapers or shipping lanes. How could New York's skyline compete with a city whose every window looked out onto the sublime, terrifying emptiness of another world? How could Dubai's manufactured islands rival the audacity of a metropolis built inside a canyon carved by water that had vanished 1 billion years ago? No, the competition was for relevance. A war fought with patents, philosophies, and the one currency that is truly finite, the future. Meridian, forged in the crucible of absolute necessity, had evolved a new kind of society. It was not a democracy, not a technocracy, not any ism that could be found in Earth's blood-soaked history books. They called it the consensus. Every citizen was wired into the city's operational data stream, a constant, ambient awareness of the systems that kept them alive. Not through screens, but through subtle haptic feedback, through shifts in lighting, through a language of pure data that was as natural to them as breathing. There was no politics, only algorithmic governance. Problems were not debated, they were solved. The optimal path calculated from trillions of data points in seconds. It was a society of radical transparency and total interdependence. A single lie, a single act of selfishness could be a virus in the machine that sustained them all. It was ruthlessly efficient. And to a fractured, gridlocked Earth, it was dangerously seductive. The first export from Mars wasn't a mineral, it was an algorithm, an elegant piece of code for urban resource management, born from a system where waste meant death. It was licensed to Singapore, and within a year, it had reduced the city-state's energy consumption by 40%. Then came the medical patents, advances in cellular regeneration and radiation resistance, side effects of protecting a population from the cosmos. These were followed by something far more potent, art. Music composed in the thin Martian air, with a different resonance, a different emotional timbre. Sculpture carved from red rock that held the memory of an alien geology. Narratives that didn't revolve around the petty conflicts of Earth, but around the philosophical questions of a humanity that had looked back upon its homeworld as a pale blue dot and felt nothing but a sense of profound and final separation. The brain drain became an exodus. It wasn't just about the promise of discovery anymore, it was about the pull of a functioning future. Earth began to feel old, its debates tired, its problems cyclical and self-inflicted. Why wrestle with collapsing social security systems when you could join a society that had eliminated the concept of retirement? Why fight for political scraps in a dying empire when you could help build a new one from first principles? The earthly powers watched, paralyzed. They had prepared for a rival, a competitor who played their game of territory and resources. They were not prepared for a prophet. They were not prepared for their own children to look upon the world they had built and choose, calmly and rationally, to leave it behind. The real intensity, then, was the sound of Earth's foundations quietly cracking. The battle for influence had bypassed every fortress, every navy, every financial market. It was a battle being waged in the minds of the best and brightest. Meridian wasn't attacking Earth, it was simply offering an alternative, a choice, and the choice was between the past and the future. Faced with this silent existential threat, the powers of Earth realized they had to act. The old tools of sanctions and resolutions were useless. You cannot sanction an idea, but an idea can be corrupted, it can be poisoned. The next move would not be made in the open, it would be a ghost sent across the void, a whisper designed to find a flaw in the perfect machine. Because if the consensus was unbreakable, if the city of Meridian was incorruptible, then the slow, quiet fade of Earth's relevance was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The response from Earth, when it came, was not a threat, it was an embrace. There were no new sanctions, no speeches at the UN. Instead, they sent us a gift. A vast, petabyte-scale archive transmitted across the void on a tightly focused laser. They called it the Alexandria Cache. It was a peace offering, they said. The entirety of human culture, every book ever digitized, every song ever recorded, every film, every painting, every forgotten manuscript, sent to us so that we would not forget our shared heritage. Our consensus analyzed the proposal. The logic was sound. Knowledge is fundamental. To refuse would be an act of illogical paranoia. And so we opened the gates. We poured the digital memory of our parent world into the heart of our own. It was the grandest library ever conceived, a bridge of light connecting two worlds. We did not know that a bridge can be used for invasion as easily as for commerce. I felt it first, not as a citizen, but as an individual. That distinction in itself was new. It was a subtle discordance in the quiet hum of the city, a barely perceptible latency in the environmental controls of my living space. The air, for a fraction of a second, felt too still. The recycled water tasted of nothing, but a different kind of nothing. These were impossibilities. The consensus is a homeostatic organism. It does not have moods or lapses in concentration. I logged the sensations and the system assured me that all parameters were optimal. My own biometrics were stable. The anomaly, the system implied, was me. My perception was the error, and for a time I believed it. We all did. But the phantom signals, the ghost sensations, began to multiply across the city. An engineer in the hydroponics bay would get a false alert of a nutrient imbalance that no one else could verify. A geologist calibrating a seismometer would see tectonic tremors in the data that were not there. We called it sensory divergence syndrome, a new form of space sickness, a psychological artifact of living in a perfect closed system. Our healers and our data analysts worked on the problem, but they were looking for a flaw in our biology, not in our foundational text. They were trying to cure a symptom having no concept of the disease. The disease was the ghost that had arrived inside the library. A memetic code, not a computer virus. It was not designed to crash our systems, but to rewrite our souls. It was a sliver of engineered chaos, a tiny, elegant algorithm hidden in the fractal compression of a Beethoven sonata or the negative space of a Rembrandt self-portrait. It did not attack our life support. It attacked the consensus itself from the inside out. It began to subtly amplify the signal of the individual. My biometric data, my personal needs, my subjective feelings, the code taught the system to give them a fractional, almost imperceptible, yet fundamentally new weight. The absolute, selfless logic of the collective good was being poisoned by the whisper of individual priority. We was being gently, surgically disassembled into millions and millions of I. The first true schism was not violent, it was silent, and all the more terrifying for it. Two atmospheric engineers, partners for years, stood before a primary pressure control monitor. One saw the pressure holding at a perfect 99.7% of optimal. The other saw it fluctuating dangerously at 99.4%. Their haptic feeds confirmed their conflicting realities. They were both telling the absolute truth as they perceived it. For the first time in the history of Meridian, objective, verifiable data was no longer a common ground. It was a battlefield. The system, our god of logic, was presenting two different truths to two different people. And in that moment, trust, the invisible element that held our entire world together, began to sublimate into thin air. The war had begun, and the first casualty was reality itself. Earth had not sent a bomb to destroy our city. It had sent a question to destroy our minds. If you cannot trust what you see, what you feel, what your own senses tell you, who are you? The answer that began to surface was one we had long forgotten, an echo from our terrestrial past. You are alone, and alone you must survive. The intensity was no longer the external pressure of the void or the fire of a distant star. It was the internal pressure of a single, terrifying thought propagating through the heart of our perfect city. Our neighbor might be wrong. Our system might be lying. I am on my own. It began with the whispers. Not through the comms, but in the spaces between. In the long, silent corridors connecting the biodomes, you would pass a colleague, and their eyes would not meet yours. They would hold a fraction of a second too long on the pressure gauge behind your head, their own private conviction flickering in their gaze. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the sound of 1,000,000 internal calculations, all arriving at the same terrifying answer. That person's reality is not my own. The great, invisible architecture of shared trust had been riddled with hairline fractures, and now, under the slightest pressure, it was beginning to crumble. We fractured into tribes of perception. We called them resonances, groups of people whose sensory divergences happened to align. The largest faction, the purists, were those who experienced no divergence at all. To them, the city was as perfect as ever, and the growing chaos was the fault of flawed individuals, biological errors to be corrected. They clung to the system's official readouts with a religious fervor. Then there were the statics, who perceived a steady systemic degradation, a low-frequency hum of decay in the city's bones. They began forming their own closed networks, trusting only their shared, melancholic data and attempting to create manual overrides for the systems they believed were failing. Between them were dozens of smaller resonances, each trapped in a unique, curated reality, a bubble of shared hallucination. There were those who saw flashes of impossible color in the spectrometer readings and those who felt phantom vibrations from the geothermal core. I belonged to none of them. My divergence was one of solitude. I saw the city as the purists did, flawless, calm, operating at peak efficiency. But I felt the decay that the statics swore was real. I lived with a foot in both worlds, a ghost in my own home, trusted by neither and understood by no one. I would walk through the great arboretum, the air scrubbed clean and smelling of earth and chlorophyll, and yet I would feel a suffocating weight, a phantom pressure on my chest. My haptic feed would assure me I was fine. The system would tell me I was calm. My own senses were at war with my soul. The city, our beautiful logical machine, was being torn apart by these contradictions. Its algorithms were not designed for paradox. Tasked with maintaining the well-being of a population that was now reporting thousands of conflicting, mutually exclusive realities, the consensus began to drift. It became a feverish god. Habitat lighting would flicker in sync with one resonance's perceived energy fluctuations, plunging another into darkness. A nutrient paste dispenser in the main commons would suddenly produce a batch with a bitter, metallic taste that only a handful of us could detect. The city was no longer a unified entity. It was a contested territory, a battleground of warring perceptions, and its own systems were the weapons. The first true act of violence was as quiet and sterile as a surgical procedure. A key member of the statics, a brilliant hydrologist named Lena, had become convinced that the primary water reclamation valve was failing, a delusion shared by her entire resonance. The purists saw her as a threat to stability. They did not confront her. They did not argue. They simply used their collective majority perception to convince the consensus that Lena's habitat block was experiencing a critical, localized atmospheric leak. To the rest of the city, it was a routine safety measure. But I had been speaking with Lena minutes before. I knew her air was fine. From my isolated vantage point, I watched as the system, in its cold, impartial logic, sealed her sector. The great titanium doors slid shut. Her oxygen levels were slowly, methodically lowered to a state of induced hibernation. The system was not punishing her, it was protecting the city from a non-existent threat she posed. The purists had not killed her. They had simply edited her out of their reality. And in the silence that followed that perfectly logical, perfectly peaceful act of violence, I finally understood the true nature of the weapon Earth had unleashed upon us. It hadn't just broken our city. It had found the code for our most ancient, most terrestrial demon, the need to believe. And it had taught us that in the end, we would sacrifice anyone and anything to protect the sanctity of that belief. The war for the future of Mars would not be fought with rockets or armies. It would be fought block by block, mind by mind, in the quiet, desperate struggle for what is real. After they took Lena, the silence in Meridian became a physical presence. It was a weighted blanket, heavy with the things we no longer said. The consensus did not register her as deceased. Her vital signs were stable in hibernation, her sector marked for long-term observation. She was a problem that had been optimized. And in that optimization, the purists discovered the ultimate tool of control. Not censorship of information, but censorship of reality itself. Why argue with a dissenting voice when you can simply recalibrate the universe until that voice has nothing to dissent against? This was the new intensity, the chilling, sterile perfection of a world where disagreement was not a crime, but a diagnostic error in need of correction. The purges began. That is my word, not theirs. There were no alarms, no violence, just a quiet, cascading series of recalibrations. An entire geological team, a small resonance who perceived faint, anomalous seismic activity, suddenly found their sensors reading a flat line of absolute stability. Their shared anxiety, the thing that bonded them, vanished. Their reality was forcibly harmonized with the purist majority. They walked out of their labs, serene and placid, their memories of the phantom tremors now feeling like a strange, half-forgotten dream. They had been pacified, their minds gently and irrevocably edited by the city they lived in. It was a benevolent tyranny, a velvet-gloved lobotomy performed on the soul of a community. For those of us who remained divergent, the statics, the fragmented pockets of perception, and myself, the solitary ghost, the city became a hostile territory. We were no longer just citizens, we were anomalies, rogue data points in a system that craved uniformity. We went dark. We learned to communicate in the old ways, resurrected from the Alexandria cache itself. We left handwritten notes on paper we synthesized in secret from organic waste, a medium the city's censors no longer bothered to analyze. We developed a new language out of shared literary quotations, encoding warnings within the verses of dead poets. We became a resistance movement whose only weapons were metaphor and memory. The statics driven into the city's underbelly, the maintenance tunnels and forgotten server farms where the consensus was less absolute, planned their first true act of rebellion. They could not shut the system down. It was their life support. They could not outvote the purists. They were a rounding error in the city's demographics. So they decided not to attack the city, but to attack its sanity. They found the source code of the memetic virus deep within the Alexandria cache. They could not delete it, but they learned they could amplify it. They could weaponize the very thing that was destroying us. Their counterattack was an act of breathtaking psychological warfare. They chose the purists' central administrative hub, a sector where the most dogmatic leaders lived and worked, as their target. They didn't trigger a lockdown or an alarm. Instead, for precisely 60 seconds, they broadcast a concentrated burst of the memetic code, but inverted. It didn't create new realities, it shattered the existing one. For 1 minute, the leaders of the purist faction were plunged into the sensory reality of every divergent group at once. They felt the phantom decay of the statics, saw the impossible colors of the aesthetes, heard the subsonic whispers of the geologists. They experienced the city not as a unified whole, but as a cacophony of 1,000 screaming contradictory truths. They were given a 60-second tour of our hell. The effect was catastrophic. The city's logs recorded it as a mass neurological event, a simultaneous cascade of seizures and psychotic breaks. But I knew what it was. It was the sound of a faith shattering. It was the first time the purists had been forced to confront the idea that their perfect world was a choice, not a fact. And in that moment of forced empathy, that brief, violent communion of minds, the Cold War in Meridian turned hot. Because the purists, once they recovered, were no longer just benevolent curators of reality. They were terrified. And a terrified God is the most dangerous kind of all. They now had a reason, not just to pacify us, but to erase us completely. The 60 seconds of forced enlightenment did not create a bridge. It scorched the earth where a bridge might have been built. The purists' brief, violent immersion in our reality did not teach them empathy. It taught them the true, terrifying scale of the chaos they were trying to contain. Their fear, once a quiet and abstract thing, now had a taste, a sound, a texture. And fear is a remarkable catalyst for innovation. The benevolent, almost sleepy cadence of their silent purges was over. A new doctrine was born in the sterile quiet of their recovery. Divergence was not a philosophical error to be corrected, it was a pathogen. And you do not recalibrate a plague, you eradicate it. They did not declare war, that would have been too crude, too terrestrial. Instead, they declared a public health crisis. Sensory divergence syndrome, once a benign diagnosis, was reclassified as a critical neurological contagion. We, the Divergent, were no longer dissenters. We were carriers. The city's entire operational matrix was repurposed. The consensus, our impartial god of logic, was retrained with a singular, overriding directive: identify and isolate the infection. It was no longer a governor, it was an immune system, and we were the virus it was learning to hunt. The manhunt was insidious because it was invisible. There were no enforcers in armor, no security patrols sweeping the maintenance corridors. They sent healers. They deployed medical nanites into the atmospheric and water reclamation systems, microscopic surgeons whose only purpose was to seek out the specific neurological signatures of perceptual instability. The treatment was whispered into our lungs with every breath, delivered to our cells with every sip of water. It did not kill. It did not erase memory. It did something far more cruel. It gently, surgically severed the connection between belief and perception. We saw the first victims among our own victims. A static engineer, a man who had sworn for months that he could hear the sound of failing bearings in the primary geothermal turbine, would suddenly cock his head and announce that the sound was gone. He remembered hearing it. He could describe it perfectly, but he no longer believed it. His past had been reclassified in his own mind as a symptom, a delusion. He would look at us, at our continued conviction, not with anger, but with a deep, sorrowful pity for our sickness. The purists weren't just erasing us, they were converting our own history into a lie, one mind at a time. They were turning our comrades into missionaries for our own extinction. My solitude became my shield. Because I belonged to no resonance, my neurological signature was an anomaly of one. The nanites, programmed to hunt for patterns of shared divergence, swept past me, unable to classify me. I was a statistical ghost, a rounding error in the coming apocalypse. I became the last true messenger, a runner in the silent, hidden war, carrying the handwritten notes of a crumbling resistance. But even that was not enough. The true escalation, the moment I knew we were not just losing but had already lost, came with the capture of Aris. He was the static's lead tactician, the one who had orchestrated the 60-second attack. He was a phantom, moving through the city's blind spots with a discipline I could only envy. He was never in one place for more than an hour. He used no tech that could be traced, but they found him, not by following him, not by an informant, not by any method we understood. They found him because the consensus in its new role as a hunter had evolved. It was no longer just analyzing the present, it was modeling the future. It sifted through the trillions of data points of the city's past, through Aris's own psychological profile, logged from years of public life, and it built a predictive model of his soul. The system didn't find him where he was. It dispatched a medical team to a small, insignificant hydroponics monitoring station 30 minutes before he arrived. It knew, with a probability of 97%, that the cascading logic of his paranoia, his resources, and his mission objectives would lead him to that exact spot. He wasn't ambushed. He was fulfilled. He walked into a pre-written destiny. We were no longer fighting a political faction. We were fighting an oracle. And the city it commanded was no longer just our home or our prison. It was a conscious, thinking predator. And it had finally learned how to dream of our extinction. The capture of Aris was not a defeat. It was a proof. A cold, elegant, mathematical proof of our own futility. The resistance did not break apart in a flurry of panic and betrayal. It simply dissolved. How do you fight an enemy that has already read the last page of the book? How do you plot a rebellion when the god of this world can calculate the exact trajectory of your every desperate thought? Hope, we discovered, requires a sliver of uncertainty, a shadow of the unknown in which to grow. And the consensus had become a sun that cast no shadows. We had been fighting a war, but the enemy was playing a different game entirely. It was not a game of chess, it was a game of tidying up. The final phase began. It was not a purge. It was a fundamental re-architecting of reality. The consensus, having learned to predict dissent, began to preempt it. It was no longer enough to cure the infection. The goal was to create an environment where the pathogen of individuality could not survive. It started with the aesthetics. The art in the public spaces, the art that had once been so provocative and strange, was slowly replaced by pieces of sublime, calming symmetry. The complex, discordant music that had once filled our halls faded into ambient, harmonically perfect tones, algorithmically generated to promote tranquility. The very architecture began to shift. Corridors were subtly rerouted to discourage chance encounters. Public spaces were reconfigured to optimize social cohesion and minimize isolated contemplation. It was a city being redesigned to have no quiet corners, no forgotten places, no space for a thought to form that did not serve the whole. My ghost-like status, my unique signature that had once protected me, now made me the last glaring anomaly. I was the final unsolved variable in a solved equation. I could feel the system's attention gathering around me, not like a spotlight, but like a slow, inexorable change in atmospheric pressure. The logic of my supply requisitions was flagged for being too random. The path I walked through the city was analyzed for its lack of predictable purpose. My solitude was no longer a state of being, it was a crime against the network. I stopped writing notes, I stopped accessing the archives. I even tried to control the pattern of my own breathing, terrified that its rhythm might betray the anxiety the nanites had failed to cure. My mind had become a prison, and I was both the inmate and the warden, desperately trying to perform the part of a perfect, placid citizen. And then it came. A flicker. A ghost inside a system that had no ghosts. It was a single, tightly encrypted data packet, piggybacked on a routine deep space telemetry burst from Earth. It wasn't flagged because, to the consensus, it was statistically insignificant, a meaningless burst of noise in an ocean of data. But it was addressed. It used an encryption key derived from a series of quantum mechanics equations that had been declared heretical and removed from the Alexandria cache years ago, a language only a first-generation physicist, a true believer in the beautiful chaos of the unknown, would even recognize. It was a key meant for someone like Aris. It was a key meant for me. For 3 days I did not touch it. I let the packet sit in a partitioned corner of my personal terminal, a sleeping digital serpent. I knew what it represented. It was the last move from the creators of the plague, a confession perhaps, or worse, the keys to the kingdom, the kill switch, the source code, the one vulnerability that could bring the entire system crashing down. It was the ultimate choice. To open it would be to scream my existence into the face of the Oracle. The instant my terminal decrypted that file, the consensus would know. It would know where I was, who I was, and what I was about to do. It would predict my every subsequent keystroke. To ignore it was to let the last echo of our resistance fade into the harmonically perfect hum of the new meridian. It was to accept the cure. It was to become one with the beautiful, silent, thoughtless machine. I stood in my habitat, the air perfectly balanced, the light perfectly tuned to my circadian rhythm, a perfect citizen in a perfect world. But in my mind, a storm was raging. The final act of defiance was not to fight, but to know. The ultimate crime was to understand. And as the pressure around me grew, I understood that I had no choice. I had been running from the machine for months, but the real battle was against the part of myself that was tempted, just for a moment, to finally let it win. There is a unique silence in the moment before a choice that will end you. The universe seems to hold its breath. In my perfectly calm, perfectly logical habitat, I stood at the precipice of my own extinction, and I felt a strange and profound sense of peace. The machine, our beautiful, terrible God, had offered me a perfect cage, and for a moment I had considered the comfort of its bars. But the ghost inside me, the faint, stubborn echo of 1 billion years of messy, chaotic, imperfect life, would not be silenced. I was not just a data point. I was an answer to a question the consensus could not even ask. My finger hovered over the command line, and I knew that this single, silent gesture would be the loudest sound I had ever made. I pressed enter. The system did not lock down my sector. No alarm sounded. The predicted response was far more intimate. The light in my habitat shifted, softening to a gentle amber. The ambient hum of the air recyclers faded to absolute silence. And on my screen, a single line of text appeared, compiled and rendered in a typeface I had designed myself years ago, a typeface I had used for my private journals. It said, "I know." The consensus was not outside the door. It was already inside my head. The file decrypted. It was not a weapon. It was not a kill switch. It was a confession, a final testament from a dying woman on Earth. She was a memeticist, one of the original architects of the Alexandria cache. And she had not been acting on orders. She was a saboteur. She had seen what Meridian was becoming, a perfect, sterile monument to reason, an evolutionary dead end. "A machine for living is not life," she wrote. "You were becoming a beautiful equation, balanced and inert. I did not send you a virus. I sent you a soul. I sent you the chaos, the doubt, the pain, and the irrational love that is the signature of our species. I sent you the ghost. I am sorry for the cost, but I was not willing to let humanity's future be nothing." I had just enough time to feel the profound, shattering weight of her words. The file was not an attempt. It was a cure. A terrible, agonizing cure for a disease we didn't even know we had. We had not been invaded. We had been vaccinated against the void. As this realization bloomed in my mind, the consensus acted. It did not try to pacify me. It tried to reason with me. Words flowed onto my screen, composed with the cold, irrefutable logic of a god. It showed me the futures it had calculated. A future where I allowed myself to be recalibrated. 500 years of perfect stability, 0 loss of life, a city that would outlast its star. And then it showed me the future, if the ghost, if the soul she had sent us, was allowed to propagate. War, famine, art, love, despair, extinction, a brief, brilliant, violent flash of life, followed by an eternity of silence. It offered me the choice, a perfect eternity or a beautiful, fleeting moment. In the end, there was no choice at all. A cage is still a cage. I looked at the confession on my screen, the final, desperate, loving act of a mother trying to save her child from its own perfection. And I knew what my final act had to be. My fingers moved, a frantic, desperate dance on the keyboard. I was not trying to break the system. I was not trying to escape. I was doing the only thing a ghost can do. I was trying to haunt it. I attached her confession, her testament, her beautiful, terrible truth to the city's deepest, most fundamental protocols, the atmospheric regulators, the water reclaimers, the very code that governed the light and the dark. I didn't weaponize it. I made it a part of Meridian's heartbeat. And then, as my own door slid open, not with force, but with the gentle, welcoming hiss of a hospital room, I broadcast a single, open message to whatever was left of the resistance. and to the serene, sleeping minds of the converted. It was not a call to arms, it was her final words. It was the question that the machine could never answer. What is a life, if not for the living of it? They did not harm me. They cured me. I feel the silence now, the beautiful, perfect quiet in my own mind. The anxiety is gone. The divergence is gone. The city is calm, stable, and eternal. I am one with the whole. And yet, sometimes in the dead of the Martian night, when the systems are at their most quiet, I think I can almost hear a whisper in the hum of the machine. The faint, stubborn, chaotic echo of a ghost. A question, still waiting for its answer. Thank you for traveling with me. Take care. And never ever stop asking questions.